Thank you. Yesterday we were talking about Kiddush Lechatzoin, and we had a machlokes in the Mishnah in Menachos about a case where you have less than the shear of a mincha in the kli. Let's say the shear is an isaron, and then after he puts it in the kli sharis, he adds that increment that he needs to be mashlim the shear. According to one opinion in the Tanoim, then there's no kiddush at all lechatzoim. It's all or nothing. And Rabbi Yossi has the opinion, no, that if he puts into the kli sharis less than an isaron, less than the shear of mincha, and his intention was to add, to be mashlim the shear, then immediately it becomes kadosh, and the kli sharis is could be mekadosh. That was the Mishnah and the machlokes the Tanakama and Rabbi Yossi. Now, within Rabbi Yossi, we had a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rav. And Rav is of the opinion that even Rabbi Yossi would agree that there's no such thing as kiddush lechatzon. You can't be mekadesh chatzi isaron, even if his intention is to be mashlim the shir, because a chatzi isaron is not enough for a mincha. Whereas Rabbi Yochanan was the one who says that this is the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi holds that if your intention is to be mashlim the shir, then you can be mekadesh lechatzon. However, Rabbi Yochanan agrees that in the case of minchas chavitim, ein kedusha lechatzon, but rather he has to mekadesh the entire isaron in one kli bivasachas immediately, because with regard to minchas chavitim, the Torah says vayikra vav mincha tamid machtzisa. Now, what does that mean? Mincha machtzisa. And what it means is yesh lekadesh es isaron kulo, and then machtzisa. So the name mincha, which implies the kedusha of the carbon and its status, that comes before the word machtzisa. And that means that in minchas chavitim, where the Kohen Gadol will bring half of it in the morning and half in the evening, he's got to have lechatchila up front for the kiddush a full mincha. That's what the word mincha means. Mincha means a full isaron. Then he divides it up into two halves. He'll bring half of an isaron in the morning and half in the afternoon. But since the Torah goes out of its way to tell us that initially he's got to put a full isaron into the kli, it's telling us that ein kedusha lechatzoin in the case of a minchas chavitim. And this despite the fact that Rabbi Yossi, according to Rabbi Yochanan, was of the opinion that in other menachos there is kiddush l'chatzon, but not in the case of minchas chavitim, because the Torah went out of its way to say mincha machtzisa. It's got to be a full mincha, and then you divide it up into halves. And this is what we got up to yesterday. But today we're going to study the dissenting view of Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says that if in the case of minchas chavitim, the mincha is split into two halves, and the carbon of minchas chavitim, the Kohen Gadol will be makriv one half, and then another half, a chatzi yisaron baboker, a chatzi yisaron ben arbayim. Then since the hakrava is piecemeal, lechatzoin, therefore the kiddush itself should be lechatzoin, meaning the process of kiddush should be a mirror image, a reflection of the hakrava. If the hakrava is lechatzoin, then the kiddush should be lechatzoin. What about the drasha, the pasuk of Rabbi Yochanan? It says mincha machtzisa. Lo nemar mincha machtzisa el inyan hakdashas hamincha b'peh. In other words, we emphasized yesterday, if you recall, that Hegdesh or Kedusha, in the case of Menachos, goes through two stages. Stage one is called Kedushas Damim, and that's when he designates this solace as a mincha. Then, when he puts it into a klishares, he upgrades the kedusha to that of a kedushas haguf. When the Torah says it's got to be a mincha and then machzi, so it's referring not to kedushas haguf, but says Rabbi Eliezer, it's referring to kedushas damin. He's got to have a full isaron that he's magdish, and he designates it and says harei zeh mincha. In this case, minchas chavitin. And then he can take half of it and put it into one kli, and half in another kli, and the kli, each kli will be makadesh it and upgrade its kedusha from that of the status of domim to kedusha guf. And the reason why he could put half of an isaron into a kli, and the kli will effectuate the kedushas haguf, is because the hakrav itself is l'chatzon. So when we get to the kli, the kedushas kli, which is the kedushas haguf, there's no need to pour into the kli the whole balance of the isaron, since he's going to be maktir only half at a time, because that's what the Kohen Gadol does. He does the minchas chavit in half in the morning, half in the evening. Therefore, he can be mekadesh in the kli with half of the solus of the mincha. But again, that's all because he's up to the second stage. The first stage, which is kedushas peh, which effectuates kedushas damim, that has to be mincha and then machzis. It has to be a full shear of an isaron in the kli. Now, Tosfos has a very interesting shita. He says that this statement of Rabbi Lazar, that there is kedusha lechatzayin, that's only in chavitin. Every other mincha where the hakrava is b'masachas, then there's no kiddush kli lechatzayin. You need a kiddush kli le-shi'uro for the entire shear. And that makes absolute sense according to everything that we've seen until now. However, Tosfos has another shita, on Daf Zayin Amud Beis, in a second paritz, and Tosfos says that me'achar shematzinu bechavitim shemiskach l'chatzon hu din l'shar menachos, that minchas chavitim becomes your paradigm, your archetype for a tzad hashava for all other menachos. And since Rabbi Lazar's shita is that in minchas chavita this kiddush lechatzayin, therefore hu adin, we apply that to all menachos. Again, the first teretz of Tosfos is much more intuitive. Rabbi Lazar is talking about the unique nature of minchas chavitim insofar as the Torah requires hakrava of half in the morning, half in the evening. All right. Now he has here a footnote. Ein la hakshos al Rabbi Lazar midrashas habraisa miluim, or Malayim, I should say. Shekeni tachachu sober kidrashas zulo nemer lo mitzvah lo likuv. Kayim din malan af b'chatzi isar. So there's a pasuk. I don't have the pasuk inside. You'd have to look on, see where the Gemara quotes this pasuk called Malayim. Malayim seems that you need the full volume. It can't be the chatzon. Yeah, but the answer is that according to Rabbi Lazar, in Minchas Chavita, you don't need Malayim because the Torah says that Akrav is the chatzon. Okay, now he introduces the Brisker Rav, and it's also in another sefer called Taras HaKodesh. Yesh l'stapa. Ha'im l'das Rabbi Lazar dafka chatzi isaron miskadesh mishum shaktoras chavita mikishir zeh or af pachos mishir zeh miskadesh. The law is that out of the isaron, the Kohen Gadol has to bring half of it in the morning, half in the evening. But yet, Rebbe Elazar says, based on the special, unique halacha of Hakrava in Minchas Chavitim, that yesh Kiddush Lechatzoin. What's Lechatzoin? Does Lechatzoin mean it's got to be exactly half? And what if it's less than half? What, you're no longer in the shear. The shear is now in Isarim. Less than that shear is Pachsmi Kashir. What difference does it make whether it's 9/10 of an Isarim or it's 1/10 of an Isarim? Or shall we say no? It's got to be 50% of an Isarim because he bases it on the Hakrava, and the Hakrava has to be Mechza. Okay, now we get on to another machlokes. This is in Menachos Daf Ches. And we're talking about a mincha that's accompanied by both shemen and levona. Rav says that you can be mekadosh the soles even without the shemen. I mean, you need a precedent for that. That's mind-boggling. I mean, you need shemen. The shemen has a din of blila with the soles, and now you can be mekadosh the soles without the shemen. Oh, he says she came matzinu b'minchas lechem haponu. He ba below shemen v'chein miskadeshes l'lo levona. And also we find minchas nisachim without levona. So what we have is, in the world of menachos, we have precedents for bringing a mincha without shemen, and that's the case of minchas lechem hapanim. We have a precedent for bringing a mincha without levona, for example, in minchas nisachim, and we also have miskadeshes l'lo shemen u'levona. What if he omits both shemen and levona, and he pours the solus and only pure solus into the klishares? Matzinu b'minchas chote sheba l'lo shemen u'levona. All we have to do is find one precedent of a shem mincha, a chal shem mincha without X, we'll call it shemen, without Y, let's call it levona, and that defines your category of mincha for all menachos. All menachos are integrated into one entity called a chal shem mincha. Does that chal shem exist in the world, the constellation of menachos, without shemen? Does it exist without levona? Does it exist without shemen and levona? The answer is yes. It exists without shemen in the case of minchas lechem hapanim. It exists without levona in the case of minchas nisachim. It exists in a case where there's no shemen or levona in the case of minchas soto or minchas choter. Now, what happens if he just puts shemen into a kli sharis? So I would say that there's no such entity as a korban mincha without solus. Shemen is a wonderful addition, but shemen doesn't lend itself to a chal shem mincha. And therefore, there could never be a kiddush of shemen alone in a kli sharis. But that's not so. What's the precedent here? Belug shemen shel mitzora sheba levado lelo soles ulevona. In the parsha of mitzora, there is a separate ritual, an avoda of shemen, and we put the shemen on bonus yadav, raglav, etc., etc. Even though there's no soles, there's no levona. What happens if he adds levona into a kli sharis and only levona? Is there any precedent in the constellation of Kodshim for bringing levona? I would say yes. In lechem hapanim. Let's see if I'm right. V'chein miskadesh levona l'ashkim etzinu b'baziche levona boimim lechem hapanim. Excellent. She'ein boim el shemen el levona bilvad. The das Rabbi Chanina, all this that we've had is the das Rav, but Rabbi Chanina disagrees, and he says minchos habos im shemen levona einam miskachos. It's not enough to say that somewhere in the abstract world of menachos, I have a chal shem mincha without shemen and without levona. It's got to be relevant to this particular mincha. So if this mincha is a mincha that's accompanied by a mixture of both shemen and levona, then you can't be mekadosh the mincha unless you have not only solas in the kli, but you also have shemen, and not only solas and shemen in the kli, you also have levona in the kli. It's not sufficient to go into the abstract world, the theoretical world of menachos, and find a mincha without shemen or without levona. This particular mincha cannot be brought without shemen or levona. And therefore, the kiddush kli, which always reflects that krava, requires that you put in the kli not just soles, but also shemen and levona. That's the opinion of Rabbi Chanina. You know, you get the intuitive sense that the machlokas between Rav and Rabbi Chanina is very fundamental. Do we view all of menachos as one entity? It's mikcha achas. And when we're trying to determine the kiddush kli and how much you have to put into the kli, we can stretch our arms out all the way to every case of menachos that exists. Or do we say no? Every mincha is an entity and beats to its own drum and has its own regulations. Okay. Now let's see if we can make some progress. The next piece of our overview of menachos is very challenging because there's a lot of reality here, a lot of mitzius. You know, we're going to talk about klipos, and we're talking about ethos. You know, we'll see. We may need a little bit more time for this, but let's give it a shot. It's always good to get by the first reading. And we're going to now learn a Mishnah, and I'll tell you exactly, he says in the footnote, it's a Mishnah, where is it? Kuf Lam and Aleph. All right, he doesn't tell you where it is right now. I mean, he probably does, I just didn't find it. The unos, shlochmeos, shifos, v'chameshmeos, be'itos. So we're talking about the preparation of the menachos, what we call hachanas hamincha. Okay, so again, we have to know more about what's called shifos and be'itos. So we don't know all the details, but we're trying to beat down the wheat kernels. And a wheat kernel is covered by a klipa. We want to get rid of the klipa. The requirement of shifos and be'itos means these are different ways of getting rid of the klipa. So we're before tchina, and we want to take these kernels, make them into flour, a soles. And in order to do that, we need tchina. So the Tanakama says that before tchina, when you have the natural raw kernels of wheat, you got to beat them. And what's the purpose of beating them? Hidei shetufrad mehem klipasa. Now again, it gets even more complicated because there are a bunch of klipos, one on top of the other in a chita. And the klipa that he's talking about now is the klipa hapnimis. It's the inner klipa. She dvuka legar ide hachita. When we're talking about this very aggressive process of beating down the chita, in this way, in that way, 300 shifos, 500 mitos, then according to the Tanakama, this applies before tchit. Which I guess you would say means that the chitim are in their natural state. Yesh l'shafshafam shlosh me'es pam beholocha ubehova shel kaf hayad alir. So the shifos are a less aggressive kind of beating because you use now the palm of your hand to beat it down. And you're going to do that 300 times. Wow. Then we get to be'itos. And be'itos means you close your fist and you bang 500 times. Right? With this part of your hand. That's all according to Tanakama. And this is all taking place before Tchina. Very aggressive involvement here. Okay, so this is the opinion of the Tanakhama. L'das Rabbi Yossi, seems like Rabbi Yossi is a big expert in the Nafos. Nemar din ze b'batzek. Unbelievable. We're no longer talking about the kernels in their natural state. We're talking about after you added the water to the flour and you made a dough out of it. Is sarach lusho ba'ofen kazeh. So now we can go over the 500 shifos and the 300 shifos and the 500 bitos, and that applies to the butzik, to the dough itself. Now that's the Bavli. The Tosefta has a slightly different variant text or opinion, a record of Rabbi Yossi, that didn't say nema gamba chitim and gamba butzik. The requirement of 300 shifos, 500 bitos applies both to natural chitim in their natural state as well as the dough. And the rational mind is curious about what's going on here. You know, are these drachos? Are they talking about the reality here? And now he quotes the Rambam. Yesha kosvu shegirsa zuba tosefta enamidu dekes. The Yesha kosvu das Rabbi Yossi Ashifa he gam bechita v'gam bebotz. V'beita he rak bebotz. So you have a lot of different variables here. There's a difference between chitim and botzeik. There's a difference between shifa and be'ita. Shifa is more appropriate for chita in its natural state, and be'ita is more appropriate for botzeik. Once it's already a tough dough, you know, you can start beating it up. Okay, so let's make a note of where we got up to for today.